Do you ever think about those budget Thanksgiving meals only your Black grandparents knew? The ones born from love and tight times? For mid-century families, these Thanksgiving meals turned cheap cuts and garden staples into real holiday comfort. What part of that quiet heritage have we let fade? Neckbone and rice was one of those meals that proved your grandparents could turn almost nothing into something comforting enough to feed a whole house. Pork necks or turkey necks were the cheapest cuts in the store, the parts people walked right past, but older generations knew they held flavor if you treated them with patience. They simmered those bones low and slow until the meat slipped off like it had been waiting all day to fall apart. The broth turned rich and silky, seasoned with whatever was on hand, often just salt, pepper, onion, and maybe a bay leaf if someone had one tucked in a drawer. Then the rice went in, soaking up every drop until the pot looked fuller than what you started with. Mothers served it in big bowls that steamed up your face, stretching one pack of neck bones into something that fed cousins, neighbors, or whoever knocked on the door hungry. Neck bone and rice was not fancy, but it was real food. The kind that tasted better the longer it sat. The kind that proved a small budget never meant a small meal. Turkey backs and neck stew was the holiday trick grandparents used long before people argued about stuffing or dressing. The parts everybody else threw away became the base of some of the richest Thanksgiving gravy you ever tasted. They boiled those backs until the kitchen smelled warm and savory, pulling every bit of meat from the bones while the broth turned deep and golden. Vegetables went in next, usually onions, celery if someone had it, and potatoes to make it stretch further. The stew thickened slowly, filling the pot more than the turkey ever could. It tasted like comfort, resourcefulness, and the understanding that nothing from the bird should ever go to waste. For big families with small budgets, turkey backs and neck stew meant everyone ate well without needing a second turkey. Cornbread dressing with giblets was the dish that proved you did not need expensive ingredients for Thanksgiving to taste like Thanksgiving. The cornbread was usually day-old, sometimes even 2 days old, crumbled by hand into a big bowl that smelled like the holidays before anything else was added. The giblets, the parts many people never looked twice at, were boiled until tender and chopped small enough to disappear into the mix. Broth, onions, sage, and black pepper turned it into something soft and savory, the kind of dressing people scraped their plates clean for. It was never measured with cups or spoons. It was made by memory, by feel, by tasting a corner of the bowl and adjusting until it felt right. This was not box mix dressing. This was the real thing, passed down, perfected, and made with care. Sweet potato biscuits were the quiet genius of Black grandmothers who refused to let anything go to waste. Leftover sweet potatoes from the night before got mashed into dough to replace expensive butter, and suddenly the biscuits turned soft, warm, and slightly sweet. The color alone made children jump in their seats, little rounds of orange dough rising in the oven like tiny sunsets. They were eaten with gravy, jam, molasses, or plain with nothing but steam coming out when you tore one open. And what made them special was how quickly they came together on mornings when the house was cold, the stove was working overtime, and everyone needed something warm in their hands. Grandmothers would pat the dough with quiet confidence, never measuring, just trusting years of memory in their fingertips. When the biscuits came out of the oven, the whole kitchen smelled like comfort, thrift, and care. Sweet potato biscuits were a budget saver, but more than that, they were a reminder that creativity mattered just as much as ingredients. They tasted like thrift, love, and a kitchen that always knew how to stretch one more meal. Collard greens with smoked turkey tails were the definition of doing more with less. When ham hocks were too expensive, turkey tails stepped in as the smoky backbone of the pot. They simmered for hours with the greens, releasing flavor slowly until the whole house smelled like Sunday dinner, even if it was Wednesday. The greens softened into silky ribbons while the broth turned savory and rich. Potlikker at the bottom of the pot was prized, poured over cornbread or sipped like soup. And part of why this dish mattered so much was its patience. The pot had to sit there, quiet and bubbling, while the flavors built themselves up inch by inch. Families would lift the lid just to breathe in the steam, the kind of fragrance that wrapped around you like a blanket. No matter how tight the budget was, collard greens with turkey tails brought everybody to the table, hungry and grateful. Brown sugar candied sweet potatoes without marshmallows were the classic version that came long before holiday advertisements convinced people to pile on toppings. These were stovetop sweet potatoes, sliced thick and simmered in butter, brown sugar, cinnamon, and sometimes nutmeg if you had it. The syrup thickened slowly, coating each piece until it gleamed like amber. They tasted warm, earthy, and sweet without being overwhelming. Children always tried to sneak one from the pan before dinner, and grandparents always pretended not to notice. The beauty of this dish was that it never needed anything extra to shine. The potatoes themselves were filling, comforting, and a luxury in their own right, even when money was tight. Stirring the pot felt like tending to a small treasure, watching the slices soften and glow. This dish did not need bells, whistles, or marshmallows. It just needed time and steady hands. Hog maw and potatoes came from a tradition where nothing edible was ever thrown away. Pork stomach might sound intimidating today, but older generations turned it into a hearty meal that flavored every potato in the pot. Cleaned, boiled, and seasoned, the hog maw softened into tender slices that mingled perfectly with the vegetables around it. Potatoes soaked up the savory broth until they tasted richer than meat itself. The dish cooked long and slow, filling the house with the kind of warmth that made even cold days feel easier to bear. Someone always kept watch over the pot, giving it a stir, tasting the broth, adjusting the salt the way their parents taught them. This was the kind of dish families made when money was thin but pride ran deep. It was filling, reliable, and rooted in the belief that every part of the animal had purpose. Fried corn was the kind of side dish that did not need much but always delivered. When canned creamed corn or casseroles were too expensive, families cut kernels straight off the cob or used frozen corn, frying it in leftover drippings until it browned at the edges. A little flour thickened it, a little sugar balanced it, and the skillet did the rest. Fried corn tasted like summer and fall at the same time, sweet and savory with a warmth that made every plate feel fuller. The sound of it crackling in the pan was a comfort all on its own. Children hovered with plates ready before the spoon ever hit the dish. Fried corn was quick, adaptable, and dependable, the kind of food that filled bellies without draining wallets. It stretched meals, filled bellies, and made children ask for seconds before they finished their first serving. Navy bean pie was the sweet surprise that came from ingenuity in Black Muslim communities, especially when fruit pies were too pricey for the holidays. Beans were boiled until soft and blended with sugar, eggs, butter, and spices until the filling turned smooth and creamy. The result tasted like a cousin to sweet potato pie, warm and spiced, but always with its own quiet character. Nobody believed it was made from beans until they saw the recipe with their own eyes. The pie baked slowly, letting the spices bloom and the filling set into a custard-like texture. It sliced cleanly, each piece holding its shape while still melting on the tongue. Navy bean pie was a dessert of faith, patience, and resourcefulness, a testimony to making the most with what you had. It was proof that dessert did not need to be expensive to be delicious, memorable, and worth waiting for. Molasses glazed carrots were the budget side dish that made ordinary vegetables feel like something special. Molasses was cheap, lasted forever, and added a deep sweetness that sugar could not match. Carrots simmered in butter and molasses until they softened and glistened. The glaze clung to every bite, warm and comforting without being heavy. And for grandparents, this dish represented the way they cooked every day, using what they had, choosing flavor over flash, and trusting simple ingredients to shine. The pot simmered quietly, filling the kitchen with the earthy smell of carrots meeting warm syrup. Children would poke a fork in before it cooled, eager to taste the shiny pieces. These carrots tasted like old-fashioned cooking in the best way, the kind passed down from families who knew how to stretch the pantry without sacrificing flavor. Slow-cooked black-eyed peas were more than a side dish on Thanksgiving tables. They were a quiet promise of prosperity wrapped in the kind of practicality your grandparents lived by every single day. The peas soaked overnight in a chipped bowl that had seen more holidays than anyone in the house, swelling slowly in cool water while the family slept. The next morning, somebody reached into the freezer for bones saved all year long, tucked into bags from roasts, baked meats, and Sunday dinners. Nothing ever went to waste, and those bones held flavor that money could not buy. They simmered in a heavy pot with onions, garlic, and a pinch of red pepper, bubbling gently until the kitchen smelled warm and earthy, like a home waking up. The peas softened slowly, soaking in the broth until every bite tasted deep and familiar, the kind of flavor that came only from patience. Children dipped spoons straight into the pot when no one was looking, blowing on the steam before sneaking a taste. Black-eyed peas stretched meals, filled plates, and made sure every person who walked in the door had something to eat. They were inexpensive, humble, and comforting, and somehow that simplicity made them feel essential to the holiday. Every family had their own way of seasoning them, but the meaning stayed the same. They tasted like tradition, survival, and quiet hope for better days ahead, the kind of hope you could scoop with a ladle and share with the whole table. Potato cakes from leftovers were the kind of dish grandparents relied on when they were determined to make sure nothing from Thanksgiving went into the trash. Those leftover mashed potatoes, cold and stiff from a night in the icebox, were mashed again with onions, flour, a beaten egg, and whatever seasoning someone could spare without hurting the budget. The mixture turned into a thick dough that stuck to the spoon, heavy enough to feed a crowd, but gentle enough to shape. Grandmothers scooped it into their hands, flattening it into small patties that sizzled instantly when they hit the greased skillet. The edges turned crisp, golden, and a little lacy, while the center stayed warm and soft like the mashed potatoes had been reborn into something better. Children hovered nearby waiting for the first batch, always too eager to let them cool. Potato cakes stretched a little food into a lot, filling plates with something hot, real, and deeply satisfying. They were eaten for breakfast, lunch, or as a side dish next to greens and turkey scraps, and no one ever complained. Potato cakes tasted like determination dressed up as comfort, proof that simple ingredients handled with care could turn into the kind of meal families remembered for years. Turkey wing roast was the clever answer Black grandparents relied on when a whole bird was too expensive, but the holiday spirit still insisted on turkey being on the table. A package of wings cost only a fraction of a full turkey, but once seasoned and slow roasted, they filled the house with the same warm smell everyone waited for all year. The wings were rubbed with salt, pepper, garlic, paprika, and whatever secret blend a grandmother kept tucked in her apron pocket. Then they were tucked into a roasting pan with onions and a little broth to keep them juicy. Hours later, the skin turned crisp and brown while the meat slipped from the bone with almost no effort. No one at the table cared that the bird was not whole. They cared that it was tender, well-seasoned, and made with love. Turkey wing roast tasted like victory over a small budget, a meal that proved creativity mattered more than cost. Stewed cabbage with salt pork was one of those dishes that looked simple, but tasted like it had been simmered in memories passed down through generations. A giant head of cabbage was cheap, filling, and able to feed anyone who came hungry, which made it priceless in households where money stretched thin. Grandparents chopped it into thick ribbons that hit the pot with a satisfying hiss when they met hot fat. A small handful of salt pork, not much at all, melted slowly into the pan and coated every piece of cabbage with smoky richness that fooled the taste buds into thinking something much fancier was cooking. The pot simmered gently until the cabbage turned soft and sweet, soaking in all the flavors around it. Children did not always understand why something so plain tasted so good, but they always asked for seconds. Stewed cabbage tasted like thrift, warmth, and the comfort of knowing a big pot could feed every soul in the house. Cracklin cornbread was the kind of dish that made adults smile before it even reached the table because they knew exactly what was hidden inside. Cracklings were the crisp bits of pork left over after rendering fat, the pieces many people tossed aside but grandparents treasured. Mixed into cornbread batter, they added salty flavor and texture that turned a simple pan of bread into a holiday event. The cornbread baked until the edges crisped and the top browned just enough to split when someone pressed it lightly. Every slice held tiny surprises, little bursts of savory richness wrapped in warm corn sweetness. And long before boxed mixes ever entered the kitchen, this was the kind of bread that showed up at gatherings, church dinners, and holiday meals where every contribution mattered. Cracklin cornbread filled stomachs and stretched meals, and the smell alone could pull children inside from the yard. This was the bread that filled bellies when fresh meat was too costly, turning scraps into something worth celebrating. Pressure-cooked pig feet or hocks were the celebration food that showed up on the table when families wanted something special but still had to watch every dollar. Pig feet and hocks were cheap, tough, and humble, but a pressure cooker changed everything. Grandparents seasoned them heavily and sealed the pot, letting the steam work its magic. Minutes later, the kitchen filled with the deep, rich aroma of meat, turning tender enough to fall apart under a fork. The broth became thick and silky, perfect for sopping with cornbread. Pig feet tasted bold, savory, and deeply satisfying. A reminder that good food did not have to be expensive. And for many families, this dish carried tradition, pride, and a connection to older generations who cooked the same cuts in cast iron pots before pressure cookers existed. The meal was messy, flavorful, and guaranteed to bring everyone to the table. Bread pudding with raisins was the dessert that proved even stale bread had a second chance at life in a grandparent's kitchen. Old slices were torn into pieces and soaked in warm milk, sugar, eggs, cinnamon, and nutmeg until they softened completely. A handful of raisins, saved for special days, went into the mix like tiny jewels. The pudding baked until the top turned golden and crisp, while the inside stayed soft and custard-like. Each spoonful tasted warm, sweet, and comforting, the kind of dessert that filled the room with a sense of togetherness. Bread pudding tasted like gratitude for every scrap, and for children, it felt like magic that something so simple could taste so rich, especially when served warm with a little syrup or cream poured over the top. In houses where nothing was wasted, this dessert was proof that love and creativity could turn leftovers into something unforgettable. Old-fashioned potato salad with relish was the kind of holiday side dish that did not need anything fancy to win people over. Potatoes were cheap and filling, boiled until tender and mixed with chopped eggs, mayonnaise, mustard, onions, and a spoonful of relish that brightened everything. The taste was creamy, tangy, and familiar. It always disappeared faster than anything else on the table. Potato salad held memories of picnics, church gatherings, and holidays spent shoulder to shoulder with family. And because every grandmother made hers slightly differently, each bowl carried its own story, its own touch of sweetness or spice, its own balance of flavors learned through years of practice. You could always tell who made the potato salad without even asking. That recognition alone made it feel like a piece of home no matter where it was served. Tomato gravy over biscuits was the Southern solution to making a holiday table feel whole even when meat drippings were scarce. Canned tomatoes were simmered with flour, onions, and butter until the mixture thickened into something velvety and rich. Poured over hot biscuits, it tasted like a warm hug on a cold day. Tomato gravy stretched meals and made the simplest ingredients feel festive. And long before people debated which dishes counted as holiday staples, this gravy showed up quietly and confidently, turning plain bread into something worth gathering around. The tangy sweetness of the tomatoes mixed with the buttery biscuits created a flavor that lingered long after the meal ended. For families with limited means, tomato gravy was proof that the right touch could transform anything into a feast. Okra and tomatoes was the dish grandparents relied on when they needed something hearty but inexpensive. Sliced okra simmered slowly with tomatoes, onions, and garlic until the pot turned thick and stew-like. It was filling, comforting, and perfect with rice or cornbread. Okra and tomatoes tasted like summer preserved for winter, a reminder that generosity did not depend on money. The dish carried the flavor of gardens, of jars of canned tomatoes saved from warmer months, of long afternoons spent shelling or slicing vegetables on the porch. It was the kind of meal that stretched far without ever feeling thin. Every bite tasted familiar, grounding, and full of memories of families sharing what they had. It was proof that simple food could carry the deepest comfort. Brown gravy from scrap bones was the quiet hero of many Thanksgiving tables, the kind of dish that held everything together even when the budget could not. Grandparents kept bones in the freezer all year long: chicken backs, turkey necks, pork bones, anything that still had flavor left inside. When the holidays came around, they dropped everything into a pot with onion skins, celery ends, peppercorns, and sometimes a bay leaf if one had survived the year. The pot simmered for hours, slowly coaxing every bit of flavor out of those forgotten scraps. The broth turned deep and fragrant, rich in a way that no canned gravy could ever dream of becoming. Then came the roux, flour and fat whisked until golden, pulled together with that homemade broth into a thick, silky gravy. Children dipped rolls straight into the pot when adults were not looking, because the smell alone was too tempting. Grandparents called it stretching the bird, making sure every plate stayed full, even if the turkey itself was small. Brown gravy made from scrap bones tasted like care, like the instinct to make enough even when there should not have been enough. It poured over rice, potatoes, stuffing, and whatever else needed warmth. No drop was ever wasted. Today, people toss bones without a second thought, but older generations knew that flavor lived in the parts no one saw. This gravy felt like respect for the food, for the effort, and for the people gathered around the table. Gizzard stir-fry with peppers and onions was the kind of dish that made children raise their eyebrows until they tasted it, because grandparents had a gift for turning inexpensive ingredients into something that tasted better than most restaurant meals. Gizzards were cheap, chewy, and overlooked, but when cleaned, simmered, and sautéed properly, they became tender bites packed with flavor. Grandparents would start by parboiling the gizzards until they softened, filling the house with a deep, savory aroma that let everyone know something good was cooking. Then came the skillet, hot, oiled, ready for action. Sliced onions hit the pan first, sizzling loudly as they softened. Then bell peppers, colorful and sweet, followed by the gizzards, now sliced thin to soak up every seasoning in the skillet. A little garlic, a little salt and pepper, maybe paprika or cayenne if the pantry allowed. The mixture cooked down until the peppers went soft, the onions caramelized, and the gizzards absorbed every bit of flavor. Served over rice or alongside potatoes, this dish stretched the meal and filled every stomach at the table. It was not fancy, it was not expensive, but it tasted honest, hearty, and full of the kind of flavor only tradition can create. Gizzard stir-fry was proof that nothing needed to go to waste, and that even the humblest cut of meat could feed a family with pride. It was a holiday side dish that understood survival and celebration at the same time. Rice and gravy was the holiday insurance plan, the guarantee that no one, absolutely no one, would leave the table hungry. Rice was cheap, filling, and reliable, the kind of ingredient grandparents leaned on when the turkey was small or the sides were stretched thin. On Thanksgiving, a big pot of rice sat steaming on the stove, waiting for ladles of rich homemade gravy to transform it into something worthy of the celebration. The gravy usually came from scrap bones, pan drippings, onion skins, and whatever herbs a family might have had tucked in the back of a cabinet. Poured over fluffy rice, it turned into comfort food at its finest: warm, savory, satisfying, and impossible to stop eating. Children used their rolls to scoop up every last bit, while adults appreciated how much the dish stretched the meal without stretching the budget. Grandparents believed rice and gravy was more than filler. It was respect. Respect for the food they had, the mouths they needed to feed, and the tradition of never letting anyone feel left out at the table. In many families, Thanksgiving did not begin with carving the turkey. It began with that first spoonful of rice soaked in gravy, reminding everyone that abundance was something you created, not something you bought. Rice and gravy tasted like generosity in its simplest, purest form. Buttermilk hoecakes were the skillet bread that appeared when yeast rolls were out of reach, proving that holidays did not need expensive ingredients to feel complete. made from cornmeal, buttermilk, a little flour, and a hot cast iron skillet. Hoecakes were quick, comforting, and wonderfully versatile. Grandparents mixed the batter by hand, pouring it into the skillet where it hissed and bubbled as the edges crisped almost instantly. The cakes browned quickly, turning golden with dark little flecks from the cornmeal and the heat of the pan. Served hot, they were soft on the inside and crisp on the outside, perfect for soaking up gravy, potlikker, or syrup. Hoecakes tasted like the best parts of cornbread and pancakes combined, simple but deeply satisfying. They carried the heartbeat of Southern kitchens, where resourcefulness mattered far more than showy ingredients. On Thanksgiving, they stepped in for bread rolls that were too expensive to make or buy, filling plates and bellies with warmth. Hoecakes had a way of making even the leanest meals feel whole, reminding families that flavor comes from skill, not cost. They were bread for those who had little, made by hands that always knew how to make enough. Pickled beet plates or pickled egg plates were the colorful sides that brightened a Thanksgiving table without costing much at all. Grandparents loved these dishes because they required almost no fresh ingredients, lasted forever in the refrigerator, and added a burst of tang that cut through heavy holiday plates. Pickled beets came from jars or from boiling cheap beets bought in bulk. Pickled eggs were made by submerging hard-boiled eggs in beet brine or vinegar seasoned with peppercorns, onions, or cloves. The result was vibrant, ruby-colored eggs that looked festive and tasted bold and slightly sweet. These dishes balanced the richness of turkey, gravy, and dressing, making the meal feel fuller and more thoughtful. They were also reliable. They could be made days ahead, stored easily, and served cold. In households where every ingredient needed to work double time, pickled sides added flavor without using the stove or stretching the budget. They brought brightness, acidity, and nostalgia, filling holiday tables with color and memory. Pickled plates were proof that beauty in a meal did not come from price, but from imagination and tradition. Macaroni and cheese made with evaporated milk was the holiday version that survived long before fancy cheeses and heavy cream were options. Grandparents kept cans of evaporated milk in the pantry because it stayed fresh, cost little, and delivered rich flavor without needing expensive dairy. The macaroni boiled on the stove while a separate pot warmed the evaporated milk with butter, salt, pepper, and whatever cheese could be afforded. Sometimes sharp cheddar, sometimes processed cheese, sometimes a mix of scraps saved across the month. Everything was stirred together until the sauce thickened, coating each noodle in a creamy, soulful blanket. This was not restaurant mac and cheese. It was sturdier, heartier, and more deeply comforting. Children scraped their plates clean, adults went back for seconds, and the casserole dish was always empty before dessert appeared. This mac was a symbol of the holiday table, a reminder that richness did not require wealth. It required patience, thrift, and a belief that everyone deserved something special on Thanksgiving. Macaroni and cheese with evaporated milk tasted like tradition, pride, and the creativity that defined Black holiday cooking for generations. Stewed apples with cinnamon were the dessert-like side dish that showed up when fruit pies were too expensive to make. Grandparents bought bags of bruised apples from local markets because they were cheap, even though they looked rough on the outside. Once peeled, sliced, and cooked down with butter, sugar, cinnamon, and a splash of water, those imperfect apples transformed into something tender, fragrant, and comforting. The kitchen filled with the smell of warm spice, turning even the simplest meal into something that felt special. The apples simmered slowly until they softened into a thick, golden stew that tasted like pie filling without the crust. Served in bowls or spooned over biscuits, they were sweet enough to count as dessert, but practical enough to count as a vegetable side. Children loved them because they tasted cozy, familiar, and festive. Adults loved them because they stretched a small amount of fruit into a dish big enough to feed many. Stewed apples proved that holiday flavor came from technique, not cost. They were simplicity at its most beautiful, turning bruised fruit into a dish families talked about long after the plates were cleared. Field pea succotash was the kind of dish that came straight from the land, the garden, or the cheapest corner of the market, yet tasted rich enough for a holiday table. Grandparents mixed field peas, beans, and corn, whatever they had available, and simmered everything with onions, peppers, butter, and sometimes a scrap of smoked meat for depth. The result was a warm, hearty pot bursting with flavor and color. Succotash stretched easily, meaning a small amount of ingredients could feed many people. It tasted like the South in one bowl, earthy, sweet, savory, and satisfying. On Thanksgiving, it stood proudly next to the more expensive dishes, holding its own because it carried the taste of home, memory, and hard work. Succotash reflected a farming past where families relied on what grew in their soil and what could be preserved for winter. It was more than a side dish. It was a reminder that abundance did not come from a store. It came from hands willing to plant, harvest, and cook. Field pea succotash tasted like tradition wrapped in thrift, a dish that brought generations together around one pot. Turkey giblet soup was the quiet starter that used every scrap of the Thanksgiving bird, long before cooking shows romanticized nose-to-tail eating. Grandparents knew the value of giblets, the neck, liver, gizzard, and heart, and they simmered them with onions, celery, carrots, and seasonings until the broth turned rich and fragrant. The soup thickened slightly as the vegetables softened, turning into a comforting, savory bowl that warmed everyone up before the main meal arrived. Some families added rice, some added noodles, some kept it simple, but every version was filling and flavorful. Giblet soup stretched the meal, making sure nothing went to waste and everyone ate well. Children sometimes frowned at the idea until they tasted it, then went back for seconds. Adults appreciated the practicality, the thrift, and the deep flavor that came from slow-cooking, simple ingredients. This soup was not just food, it was philosophy. That everything had purpose, that nothing should be thrown away, and that a holiday meal could be built from the smallest pieces. Turkey giblet soup tasted like legacy, resourcefulness, and the true spirit of Thanksgiving. Stuffed bell peppers with rice and ground beef were the kind of side that turned heads when it hit the table. Bright and hearty, they stood tall among casseroles and greens, filled with flavor and pride. Inside the tender peppers was a mixture of rice, onions, tomatoes, and seasoned beef, a recipe that stretched a little meat into something plentiful. For African-American cooks, this dish was a testament to resourcefulness. It showed how creativity could make even modest ingredients taste rich. During Christmas, they were baked until soft and bubbling, the aroma filling every corner of the home. Some added a touch of cheese on top. Others stuck to the basics, letting the natural sweetness of the pepper shine. They were filling and balanced, the perfect bridge between a main dish and a side. The bright colors made the table glow, and the taste made everyone smile. These peppers were a small luxury, proof that even in lean years, celebration could still look beautiful. It was food with color, heart, and soul, crafted from care and imagination. Pecan pie was the Southern reunion classic that tasted like sweetness, crunch, and memory baked into a golden brown slice that reflected the trees and fields many families grew up around. Grandmothers gathered pecans from the yard or accepted bags from neighbors who shared what their own trees had dropped, washing and sorting the nuts before stirring them into the glossy filling of sugar, eggs, butter, and syrup that came together like a thick, shining caramel. As the pie baked, the top formed a crackled layer of toasted pecans, while the inside stayed soft, sweet, and gooey, creating the perfect contrast when cut into warm slices. Served at reunions, pecan pie reminded everyone of fall harvests, winter holidays, and afternoons spent cracking shells on front porches while stories filled the air. It was rich but never overwhelming, and even a thin slice felt decadent and comforting. Families carried it to gatherings wrapped in foil or cloth and placed it proudly among the other desserts, knowing it would vanish quickly once plates were passed. Pecan pie carried history, flavor, and the strength of generations who knew how to make something precious from simple ingredients. Pickled pig's feet with rice was a breakfast plate that blended tang, tradition, thrift, and a powerful sense of cultural memory. Pig's feet were boiled, seasoned with spices, and pickled in vinegar, creating a dish that was both flavorful and long-lasting in households where preservation was survival. Served cold from jars or warmed gently on the stove, they were paired with rice, which balanced the sharp tanginess and made the meal hearty enough to carry people through long days of labor. For families with limited resources, this dish ensured that every single part of the hog was used and nothing valuable went to waste. The pickling process preserved the meat, allowing it to last far beyond what fresh cuts could manage in kitchens without refrigeration. Though the flavor was bold, tough, and not to everyone's taste, it carried strong roots in African American food traditions shaped by necessity and resilience. Rice added comfort, balance, and affordability, turning the plate into a full meal that could feed many. Pickled pig's feet with rice was not just food, but a cultural marker of thrift and endurance. Though rarely eaten today, it once stood as an important morning staple. Vanilla wafer banana pudding was the quiet masterpiece that families prepared the night before because everyone knew it tasted better after waiting. Grandma layered those vanilla wafers, bananas, and pudding like she was building a story, one chapter at a time. She always used a glass dish so you could see each layer, each memory stacked on top of the last. The wafers softened overnight, turning from crisp cookies into tender bites that tasted like childhood. The bananas darkened just a little, sweetening as they settled into the custard, and the pudding, creamy, cool, and smooth, brought everything together the way elders often did, without saying much. Banana pudding was the dessert you could count on to show up at Christmas, Easter, church dinners, or any gathering where family needed a reminder of who they were. In the 70s, when days were long and work was heavy, this pudding waited in the refrigerator like a promise of comfort after whatever the world had taken that week. Kids scraped the sides of the pan, adults got the first big scoop, and no one complained because everyone got exactly what they wanted. It was simple, humble, and unforgettable. A dessert of patience, time, and tenderness. Homemade rolls with butter-brush tops were a gift of patience and warmth. Before store-bought bread took over, these rolls were kneaded by hand, rising slow in the corner of a warm kitchen. The scent of baking bread was enough to make children hover near the oven, waiting for the first golden batch to come out. Butter melted and shimmered on their tops, soaking into the soft, pillowy dough beneath. They weren't just sides, they were gestures of care. Each roll meant time spent, hands working, hearts focused on family. During Christmas dinners, baskets of these rolls were passed around before the meal even began, the first thing to break the silence of waiting. People used them to scoop up gravy, wipe clean plates, or cradle a bit of leftover ham. They tasted like home, like love that was made visible in food. No fancy machines, no shortcuts, just flour, yeast, water, and skill born from generations of cooks who knew exactly how dough should feel. The first bite was always soft, buttery, and slightly sweet, the kind of comfort that could make any holiday perfect. Caramel cake was the kind of reunion dessert that revealed who in the family had the patience and skill to stand over a hot stove, stirring icing long enough to make it perfect. The cake layers themselves were simple, tender and pale, but the icing was where the magic lived, thick, sweet, and slow cooked, until it deepened into a golden brown that tasted like butter warmth and memory. Grandmothers guarded their caramel icing method with pride because it took steady hands and a calm heart to keep the sugar from scorching as it bubbled and darkened in the pot. Once ready, the icing was poured over the stacked layers while still warm, spreading into silky drapes that coated every inch before cooling into a soft caramel shell. At reunions, the caramel cake always looked humble on the outside, but the moment it was sliced, people hurried forward for a piece because they knew the flavor inside carried generations of practice. The icing melted on the tongue with a sweetness that felt deep and comforting, and the cake beneath was tender enough to soak up every drop. Caramel cake tasted like real labor poured into something meant to be shared and celebrated. It reminded everyone that the best desserts came from time, attention, and love stirred slowly over a warm stove. Sweet potato coffee cake was a breakfast that carried warmth, thrift, and community in every slice. Families would mash leftover sweet potatoes into the batter, seasoning it with cinnamon, nutmeg, and sometimes cloves before baking it in heavy cast-iron pans that gave it a perfect crust. The result was moist and spiced, with a natural sweetness that came not from sugar, but from the potatoes themselves, making it both healthy and filling. It was often served at church gatherings or Sunday breakfasts when a little something special was needed on the table to bring people together. The dish reflected African-American traditions of stretching what was available into something memorable, proving that nothing went to waste in kitchens where creativity was survival. Sweet potatoes were plentiful and affordable, making them an easy way to feed a family while also adding vitamins and nourishment to the meal. The cake was often paired with coffee, hot milk, or even molasses drinks, making it a centerpiece of mornings that were simple yet comforting. Though it is rarely baked today, this coffee cake once carried generations through hard times and sweet mornings alike, leaving memories of warmth, family, and resilience with every bite. Caramel cake with pour-over icing was the holiday showstopper that demanded respect from everyone in the kitchen, even the ones who never baked a thing. The cake itself was soft and buttery, but it was the caramel icing that turned it into something legendary. Grandma would stand over the stovetop, stirring sugar and butter until it thickened into a glossy golden river. She knew if she rushed it, the whole thing would seize. She knew if she stirred too slow, it would burn. Patience was the secret ingredient. When the icing reached the right point, she poured it over the warm cake in one slow, steady motion, letting it run down the sides like silk, no fiddling, no second chances. Once it set, the icing cracked slightly when sliced, revealing the tender cake beneath. Every slice was a celebration of effort, of tradition, of hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Caramel cake tasted like the holidays growing up. Sweet, deep, bold, and worth every minute it took. Rice and gravy was more than a side dish. It was a quiet masterpiece that turned simple meals into feasts. On Christmas Day, it soaked up every drop of flavor from roasted turkey, baked chicken, or smothered pork chops. The gravy was never just one thing. It was the story of the meal itself, made from the drippings, broth, and love left behind in the pan. It was stirred until smooth, seasoned until right, and poured over rice that had been fluffed to perfection. In many homes, rice and gravy was the glue that brought the plate together, the taste that made everything else make sense. Children waited for that rich, silky spoonful that tied meat, greens, and bread into one complete bite. No one measured anything. It was all by memory and instinct. A little more flour, a splash more broth, a taste, and a nod. That was how gravy was born. For families that had little, it was a way to make the meal stretch. For those who had plenty, it was still the favorite part of the meal. Rice and gravy held history in its smooth texture, the creativity of making luxury from leftovers and turning every dinner into something worthy of thanks. Pound cake plain or finished with a bright lemon glaze was the steady, dependable reunion dessert that anchored every long table and carried the taste of family history in every slice. Grandmothers mixed the batter by hand in large bowls, their movements slow and sure as they blended butter, sugar, eggs, and flour into a thick, smooth mixture that promised comfort long before it ever reached the oven. As it baked, the kitchen filled with a warm, sweet scent that drifted out the door and into the yard, pulling cousins and neighbors inside with the promise of something familiar. When the cake was finally unmolded, it stood tall and golden with a firm crumb that sliced cleanly and never crumbled, even when carried from house to car to reunion hall. Some families preferred it plain, letting its soft, buttery flavor shine, while others poured a glossy lemon glaze over the top, letting it drip down the sides and cling sweetly to the edges. Pound cake was beloved because it tasted like effort and patience, and because it fed a crowd without ever needing decoration. It traveled well, sat proudly on every dessert table, and never failed to disappear slice by slice as people passed by with paper plates in hand. It was not dramatic, but it was unforgettable because it tasted like home gathering stories and hands that knew exactly how long to beat the batter. Chitlin scramble was one of those breakfasts that spoke directly to resourcefulness and resilience. Chitlins, or pig intestines, were cleaned thoroughly, boiled until tender, and then chopped into small pieces. They were folded into scrambled eggs with onions, creating a dish that was both filling and flavorful. The onions added sweetness, the eggs brought balance, and the chitlins gave a richness that turned the plate into something hearty. Though chitlins are often remembered as a holiday food today, many families once ate them regularly because they were inexpensive and ensured that no part of the hog was wasted. For farm workers and laborers, a plate of chitlin scramble gave strength before long hours of work. It was not a fancy breakfast, but it was deeply tied to survival and tradition. The aroma filled kitchens, and though strong, it carried memories of both family gatherings and everyday meals. Chitlin scramble represented more than food. It was heritage served hot on the morning table. Peach cobbler was the bubbling reunion dessert that pulled people toward the kitchen long before the pan ever hit the table, filling the air with the smell of peaches, sugar, and warm spices. Whether made from fresh peaches in the summer or canned peaches during the rest of the year, the filling cooked down into a thick, golden mixture that tasted like sunshine and memory. The crust varied from family to family, sometimes a lattice, sometimes a full sheet of dough, sometimes spooned on like dumplings, but always baked until brown, crisp, and irresistible. When the cobbler came out of the oven, the juices bubbled around the edges, and the scent wrapped itself around the entire gathering, making people line up with bowls in hand. Served warm with melting ice cream, or on its own, it tasted like the heart of southern Sundays and long afternoons, spent talking, laughing, and passing plates across crowded tables. Peach cobbler was more than dessert. It was a tradition carried proudly by the cooks who prepared it year after year. If any of these dishes reminded you of a grandparent's table, drop a memory in the comments, tap like so the stories keep traveling, and subscribe if you want more food history that tastes like home.